Picture this. You're ruling one of the most powerful, absolutely feared empires in the Islamic world. Your armies, they seem completely invincible. Your borders are constantly expanding, and honestly, the world basically trembles at your name. But then, in a single catastrophic day, the whole shebang comes crashing down. Your sultan is captured alive, the army is utterly destroyed, and the empire violently splinters into pieces, leaving four royal brothers in a ruthless winner-takes-all deathmatch. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the most intense, high-stakes succession crises in history, the Ottoman interregnum. We're talking an 11-year bloodbath that literally almost erased the Ottoman Empire from the map. Okay, let's just dive right into it. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we've got the Sultan's downfall, then the rules of succession and a divided empire. After that, we'll look at Mehmed's masterstroke, the final showdown, and wrap up with the legacy of the interregnum. So kicking things off with Section 1, the Sultan's downfall, disaster at Ankara. Right, so before we can really grasp the civil war itself, we absolutely have to understand the disaster that started the fire. The Turks call this era Fetret Devri, the Ottoman interregnum. Basically an era of pure, unadulterated chaos. You see, up until the summer of 1402, Sultan Bayezid I, you probably know him as the Thunderbolt. He had turned the Ottomans into the undisputed heavyweight power in the Balkans. The guy was crushing crusades, he was besieging Constantinople, you name it. But then he crossed paths with the incredibly fearsome warlord Timur at the Battle of Ankara. Long story short, the Ottoman army completely collapsed. In a totally unprecedented disaster, Sultan Bayezid was captured alive. Let that sink in. It was the first and literally the only time an Ottoman sultan ever suffered that fate. And that single earth-shattering event triggered a really terrifying number: 11. We're talking 11 agonizing years of brotherly betrayal, constantly shifting loyalties, and just endless bloodshed. Because without that strong ruler at the top, the empire essentially fractured overnight, and the surviving royal princes just immediately turned their swords on each other. Now, a quick heads up, you might actually see some conflicting dates floating around out there, so let's clear up the timeline a bit. While that disastrous Battle of Ankara went down in 1402, a lot of scholars actually date the true start of the Civil War to 1403. Why is that? Well, Bayezid died in captivity early that year, and he left behind absolutely no universally accepted successor. So that massive power vacuum in 1403, that is when the true royal battle royale really kicked into high gear, and it ground on all the way until 1413. Which brings us right into Section 2, the rules of succession. Winner takes all. I mean, how does the whole empire just tear itself apart so fast, right? Well, the absolutely crucial thing to wrap your head around here is that there was no primogeniture. Unlike a lot of the European kingdoms where the eldest son just sort of automatically inherited the crown, the Ottoman system was a completely different beast. See, every single prince was given a province to govern. The idea was to build up their administrative and military chops. But when the sultan died, there was no law saying the eldest gets the big chair. Nope. Every single surviving son had a perfectly legitimate right to step up and fight for the throne. Whoever won became sultan. It was quite literally winner takes all. Now, usually this system was actually great for producing super strong, capable leaders. But after the disaster at Ankara, with the empire already chopped to pieces, yeah, this rule basically turned brothers into incredibly deadly rivals. Moving on to Section 3, a divided empire, the royal contenders. Okay, so let's look at how the board was set right out of the gate in 1403. It's fascinating how the power dynamics shook out. We basically have three main players here. First up is Suleiman. He's the eldest surviving son and definitely the early favorite. He managed to escape over to Europe. He controlled pretty much all the Ottoman territories there from his capital in Edirne, and he had the biggest army by far. Then we have Isa. He controlled Bursa, which was the old capital in northwestern Anatolia. But he was very much a weakened ruler because a bunch of the local lords had just declared their independence again after Timur's invasion. And finally, there's Mehmed. He's governing Amasya over in central Anatolia, and he is our patient strategist. He was young, sure, but he was incredibly politically gifted, a real master diplomat who almost never rushed into a fight. So the match was officially lit in Anatolia. Phase 1 of this massive civil war erupted right between the two brothers sharing the Asian side of the empire, Mehmet and Isa. And it was brutal.
They clashed repeatedly, fighting these super fierce engagements near Ermenibeli and Ulabat, but in the end, the patient strategist pulled it off. Mehmed completely defeated Isa. Isa actually managed to flee for a bit, but he was eventually tracked down, captured, and killed around 1405.
Honestly though, Mehmet barely even had a second to catch his breath, because Suleiman, the powerful European favorite, saw his younger brother consolidating power and decided to make his move. He took his massive army, crossed the straits, and straight up invaded Anatolia. And he was successful at first, capturing key cities like Bursa and Ankara. Now Mehmet wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't meet Suleiman in an open field battle against those kinds of overwhelming numbers. So the whole war basically devolved into this incredibly tense, grinding stalemate. Neither brother could quite figure out how to destroy the other. And you might be wondering, how on earth did Suleiman keep that massive army supplied over in Anatolia without losing his grip on Europe? Well, it brilliantly illustrates his knack for diplomacy. He secured his rear flank through the Treaty of Gallipoli, which he had hammered out earlier with the Christian powers. He gave out commercial privileges to the Byzantine Empire, Venice, and Genoa. And look, while some later Ottoman writers totally roasted him for giving up those concessions, modern historians actually look at this and say, wow, that was incredibly pragmatic. It bought him exactly the stability he needed over in Europe so he could focus 100% on trying to crush Mehmed. But raw power isn't everything. Let's look at Section 4, Mehmed's masterstroke. A brilliant ploy. So here's the million-dollar question. How do you defeat a brother who has a much larger army, who's currently occupying your cities, and who has his own borders completely secured? Well, if you're Mehmed, you don't fight him head-on. No way. You completely flip the board. See, Mehmed actually had another brother, Musa, who had been captured by Timur but was later released. Now, Musa was, well, he was a really fierce, highly volatile military commander. And in just an absolute stroke of strategic genius, Mehmed secretly unleashed him. He literally shipped Musa across the Black Sea and dropped him right into Suleiman's European territories. The mission? Attack Suleiman from behind. And guys, it worked like an absolute charm. Suleiman was forced to pack up and completely abandon Anatolia just to go deal with Musa. And sure, Suleiman won some of the early battles, but his arrogance really started rubbing his troops the wrong way. Slowly but surely, his own commanders started defecting over to Musa. By 1411, Musa was advancing on Edirne, Suleiman's forces totally crumbled, and the eldest brother was captured and killed. Just like that, Mehmet had eliminated his strongest rival without even lifting a sword himself. A total game changer. Which leaves us with the final two. Section 5, the final showdown. Mehmed versus Musa.
So the empire is basically sliced perfectly in half at this point. Musa is ruling Europe and Mehmed is ruling Anatolia. But there was a huge problem. Musa was dangerously unpredictable. He started getting really hostile toward all his neighbors, even going so far as to lay siege to Constantinople. This obviously terrified the Byzantine Empire and all the local regional powers, to the point where they basically begged Mehmed to step in. So, Mehmed crossed into Europe, but he was smart, he didn't do it alone. He put together this massive anti-Musa coalition with the Byzantine emperor and the Serbian ruler. Finally, on the 5th of July, 1413, at the Battle of Chamorlu, this coalition completely crushed Musa's forces. Musa was killed trying to flee the battlefield. And just like that, after a grueling, decade-long nightmare, Mehmed finally stood alone as Sultan Mehmed I.
So, looking back, what's the big takeaway here? Why did Mehmed actually win this thing? I mean, it wasn't because he had the biggest army or was the most aggressive fighter. It all came down to his character. He focused on building strategic alliances instead of just relying on pure brute force. He dodged unnecessary battles whenever he could. He practiced just extreme patience, basically waiting for his brothers to wear themselves out. And he was able to adapt on the fly to constantly shifting political landscapes. At the end of the day, he won because he was simply the superior statesman. And that brings us to our final part today. Section 6, Legacy of the Interregnum, Cost of Stability. You really have to ask, what happens to a society that barely survives its own royal family? Well, the trauma of this near-total collapse fundamentally rewired the Ottoman state. They woke up and realized that contested successions weren't just a headache, they were a massive existential threat. So to make sure this kind of catastrophic civil war absolutely never happened again, later rulers, especially Mehmed II, implemented a highly controversial solution: the legalization of fratricide. Yep, the systematic execution of a new sultan's brothers literally became the dark, incredibly bloody price of imperial stability. It really leaves us with a heavy, provocative thought to chew on.
Is a single, formalized act of unspeakable cruelty actually justified if it prevents a decade of mass slaughter that could potentially wipe out an entire civilization? It's a tough one for sure. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this explainer. Saying bye to everyone watching right now and just letting you know we will absolutely be back with a new explainer soon.